Thank you and welcome. We're going to have one more in our webinar series of Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition's way to keep you engaged, connected, educated, informed, and encouraged to keep riding out there in Massachusetts and beyond. My name is Galen Mook. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition of MassBike. Thanks so much for joining. With me, I have Josh Zisson from Bike Safe Boston, who will speak a little bit on the lawyerly, real-world aspects of the way that bike laws are implemented out on the streets. And we have Andrew Bettinelli from Senator Brownsberger's office. I'll ask you both to introduce yourselves in a second, but Andrew's here in the senator's stead, actually, because Senator Brownsberger is right now in caucus discussing some police reform and justice reform, some very important conversations that are actually super pertinent to today's realities out there. And so State House work never ends. One of the beauties of Massachusetts is that our State House conversations are year-round conversations. Unlike some other states, which are only in session for like 90 minutes a year, Massachusetts is very much in action. So Andrew is the legislative aide of Senator Brownsberger and can speak to the depths and the challenges of actually writing the laws and helping them get them passed, and can speak for the senator here as well. So thank you both for joining. Before I pass the mics to you, just want to let everyone know the attendee list. Thank you so much for spending your hour with us. There are a couple ways to engage. We have a chat feature and a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. For those of you new to Zoom, you are on webinar mode, which means that you are muted and you do not have video, but we do encourage participation. Today is about participation. So we want the conversation to be geared towards what you want us to talk about. Of course, we've got a little bit of primer of some of our work, but the chat feature is a way for all of us to communicate collectively. Feel free to send resources, links, questions, and just general topics in the chat for everyone to see. I recommend doing all attendees and panelists, so it's not just at all panelists. So you'll see an option down there that says all panelists and attendees. And if you want to ask a question, particularly to myself, Andrew, and Josh, feel free to do so in the Q&A. And those are questions that will pop up that we'll either answer over the air, or if we can't get to them, I can answer them after the fact in the RSVP follow-up. And we can also type answers in there as well. I'll be paying attention to that, but you two, Josh and Andrew, can feel free to jump into the Q&A just the same. So please, 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 all attendees who are hopping on, feel free to be interactive here. If for some reason internet goes out, and our apologies, we are limited by technology, please bear with us. But I do thank you for trying to make everything as virtual as possible in today's tough climates out there. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to ask Josh to just talk a little bit about your work, and then I'll pass it off to Andrew to jump in too. But Josh, why don't you give a quick primer as to where you are, which is, spoiler alert, from Cambridgeport currently, and what your role is in bike laws.
Sure. Well, my name is Josh Zisson. I've been working as an attorney for, over, I'd say, 10 years now. Specifically, I started my law practice in about 2011, dedicated entirely to representing cyclists and helping cyclists who were in crashes and helping them, get reimbursement and getting their medical bills covered after a crash, usually from the driver's insurance company, because I saw that was an area that could, use my help. And it was actually in large part due to the 2008 Bicycle Safety Act, I believe it was called, where Massachusetts bike laws were entirely overhauled. They were sort of brought into the 21st century in a really comprehensive way. And this is something that I learned about, I think, while I was still studying for the bar. At the time, what happened was a friend had been doored in Kenmore Square, and she called me and didn't know what to do. And I said, I didn't know what to do either, honestly. I told her, well, take a picture of the driver's license plate, exchange information and go to the hospital. And, in working on her case, I learned that these new laws had been enacted, and I thought, wow, these are incredibly comprehensive, and someone could build a law practice entirely focused on bike cases, representing the bike community. And then I, promptly forgot about that and went back to studying for the bar. But a few years later, when I sort of decided to go out on my own, the idea came back to me, and I just sort of got more into it. And now that makes up 90% of the cases that my partner and I handle are bike cases. Cool. So in that time, I've sort of I wouldn't say I'm an expert in how laws are enacted. I really don't know too much about that process, so I'm interested to learn about that a little bit more now. But I'm certainly a big fan of the laws that we have. I'm of the opinion that Massachusetts has some of the best bike laws in the nation, and a lot of people don't really think about it that way. But I'm fairly confident that there's not another state that has better laws.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
That's some good accolades. The bill you're referring to, I think, was a 2008-2009 session. The bicycle bill was kind of referred to, is crafted by my predecessor, David Watson, and really pushed hard by Mass Bike. One of our big purviews at Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition, of course, is statewide legislation, because anything that passes through the State House hits from the Berkshires to Belmont. So the idea of, if we're going to build a bike law, it is kind of Massachusetts' purview to keep an eye on it. And I'll shortly go through some of the bills that we're working on currently to augment, to support the bicycle bill, which was passed with some great support, and after about 10 years worth of lobbying, actually, in 2008-2009, which made things like opening a door and striking somebody a citable offense, which is very important for your profession. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Josh, for joining us. Andrew, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, and how are you doing out there? You're from Sudbury at the moment. Am I getting you in the right spot?
Coming to you guys live from the leafy suburbs of Metro West.
Yeah.
My name is Andrew Bettinelli. I'm Senator Brownsberger's chief of staff. Senator Brownsberger, as you guys may or may not know, has been in the Senate since about 2013. Was in the House from 2007 on, and before that served in local government. He's very involved in bicycle issues because he is himself a commuting cyclist, a year-round commuting cyclist, although, full disclosure, that has lessened in recent years as he's taken to running in more. But that is still part of his mythology. But we come when Mass Bike needs something filed in the Senate, they usually come to us first. I've had the privilege in my 7 years of working for Senator Brownsberger, of working with Dave Watson, Richard Freeze, and of course now Galen, all executive directors of Mass Bike. And I have worked with them and filed and drafted a fair amount of the legislative priorities that Mass Bike has. Some of our successes that we've had in recent years, I guess the big one for this year, I think, is hands-free. Mm-hmm. We didn't file that, but that certainly is one that is very important to the cycling community. And the law is not just hands-free cell phone calls, but also will just penalize anybody for holding a telephone in the car. So our previous text law said, if you're holding a telephone, you could be dialing a number, you could be doing your navigation. Now it is against the law. It is a citable offense to just be holding a telephone in a car. So I think that's a huge win in this session, but I'm sure I have more to say on that and other bills later. That's my intro.
Great. And thank you, Andrew. You are a crafter of a lot of the language of these bills too. So, the senator, of course, is an amazing ally. And just for those of you who are unfamiliar, Senator Brownsberger is from the 2nd Suffolk and Middlesex districts and is representing Belmont, where he lives, Watertown, Alston and Brighton, which is my neighborhood. Even though he's not my personal senator, he's literally across the street senator, and parts of Fenway and Back Bay as well. So he's got a pretty good swath of some kind of suburban and more of the urban core. So when we were discussing issues of bicycling, especially as they relate to the greater Boston area, where we've seen the bicycling boom and a lot of the necessary changes happening with infrastructure and enforcement that's out there, that Senator Brownsberger has been a big ally to file these bills, and Andrew has been a big ally to help write these bills. So thank you, Andrew, for your work too. The way we're going to structure this conversation is going to be a little freewheeling, but I do want to start with a little bit of Mass Bike's work and priorities in terms of what legislation is out there currently to get all attendees up to speed on to where we are at. Then I'll ask Andrew to jump in a little bit on some of the process on how these bills kind of go and formulate themselves as they go through the State House, and sometimes the challenges and barriers and how we can overcome them. And from that, I'm going to kind of lean on the attendees who are here to help with that, because it really does come down to getting allies of local legislators, local state senators, and local state reps who hear from constituents that this is a concern for them. And then I'll open up to Josh too to talk a little bit about some of the cases that he might have seen that pertains to some of these bills that are either already filed and into law or in process, or some of the challenges there. But I do want to, again, encourage everybody to use the chat in the Q&A. So if you have a question about a bill that you heard about or are filing or want somebody to support, or just really anything involved the legislative process in the state, and if you have any questions about how these bills and these laws actually get implemented, enforced. We had a lot of conversations when we had Josh on 2 months ago to talk about insurance questions. And I certainly learned a lot about what's going on with insurance and not actually. So, and that was based off all Q&A. So please, 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 this conversation is going to be geared generally by where our attendees are at. So feel free to utilize the chat and the Q&A. So cool. I'm going to share my screen. And again, with technology, things get a little tricky. So let's see if we can actually get this going. All righty. So actually, I'm just going to pull up the Mass Bike main webpage, just because this is where a lot of my repository of information is. So thank you so much for everybody who is a Mass Bike member, whether financially or advocate or just a bolster. So we appreciate your support, and it really does come down to being a coalition. So everybody who is here on the line, thank you for being a part of the movement. Some of the stuff we're working on legislatively, we have two buckets that we've broken down our work into. One of our biggest campaigns right now is revolving around electric bicycles, and I'll get into that in a second. And a little primer, we're actually going to, and next month we're going to have a full-on webinar about e-bikes, not just legislation, but how the technology, how the industry is working along there too. But e-bikes is a big deficit in where we are legislatively in terms of a definition. But what I'm going to look at is more the legislation in terms of the traffic safety issues that we're following. And the reason that I'm navigating through the webpage is so that you can follow along at home if you do go to massbike.org. I'll talk about there's three bills that I'll really bring up right now. And again, please feel free to ask questions about Mass Bike's work and to where you can actually jump in and participate. The first, which Andrew mentioned just briefly, is an act requiring the hands-free use of mobile telephones while driving. This was a 10-year-long campaign which was led by Mass Bike and a coalition called the Vision Zero Coalition, strongly through the Safe Roads Alliance. So much credit goes towards the Safe Roads Alliance, and also with Livable Streets, Walk Boston, the Boston Cyclists Union, and a whole coalition with the Vision Zero. Also, AAA Northeast has been a big ally, so we were actually able to activate the driving side of the advocacy movement. So it really is kind of a multimodal approach in which we were taking here, because we all realize that texting while driving, looking at a phone while driving, is dangerous, not just for the driver, for the passenger, but for the general public that's out there. This law actually bans handheld electronic devices, not just texting, but really anything, as Andrew was saying, if you're holding your cell phone up while you're driving. It is a primary offense. So that means a police officer can actually pull you over or pull over a driver, which was where the stickiness of the old law, which was just an anti-texting law, came into play. So we actually had a law that I believe was enacted around the same time the bicycle bill was in 2009, which banned texting while driving, but it did not ban other uses of the cell phone, such as navigation, GPS, and other devices, not just a cell phone. And if you recall back in 2008, 2009, that was when kind of iPhones were really just becoming popular. So the nimbleness of the legislative process sometimes lags behind the way that technology can leapfrog. So what we had to do was basically recraft the bill, and much credit goes to Andrew and the aides and the chiefs of staff that are working diligently in the State House to make sure that the verbiage of the bills kind of match the modern uses. It was lobbied, it was refiled, I think 6 different times since 2010, and we finally got it into play with much support from the administration of the governor, much support from the Senate and the House to really get this signed into law back right around Thanksgiving last year. We had a great ceremony with the governor signing ceremony to say, now we've got this law in place. For those of you who are really interested, what the legislation actually does, it authorizes police officers to stop drivers. Primarily, they can be pulled over and cited. And the first offense is $100, which arguably might not be very much. But the second offense is $250, and a third offense is $500. And this matches 16 other states and counting, which is going on in the country. So this is kind of putting us at the forefront of some of the conversations that are happening nationally. Some concerns about this bill, why it took so long to get really enacted, was really a conversation about bias in terms of how this would be actually implemented in an enforcement conversation. And this was arguably in 2019 that this conversation really heated up. So even before a lot of the current police reform and justice reform conversations that are happening now. So you can even imagine the environment with which we're trying to have these conversations currently is even a little bit more tense, which again is why Senator Brownsberger personally cannot be here, because he's currently in caucus discussing these very same issues. Leads me to the next conversation that we're following, which is an act relative to automated enforcement. This is actually a bill filed by the senator, so much accolades goes towards Senator Brownsberger here. It's currently in the Senate. We are pursuing this more so in the Senate and the House because we think we have a little bit more of an opportunity for robust conversations regarding automated enforcement. This bill actually made it very close to getting out on the floor even during the COVID shutdown of the legislative process. And a little forecasting, I'm going to ask you how legislation is going during COVID too, Andrew, so just be primed to answer some of that. What this would allow, though, is automation in terms of camera enforcement for certain offenses of drivers of automotive vehicles out there on the roads, specifically for running red lights, like a no right turn on red, specifically for speeding, and for failure to stop for a school bus. There are a couple of bills that are out there. One was actually pursued and put out there by Marty Walsh and the city of Boston, which was kind of a parallel bill. We're hoping to wrap some of these bills all together. It's currently in the conversation of what's going on. It hasn't actually made it out to vote yet, although it became very close a couple months ago, about a month and a half ago. We're hopeful that this might go through an informal session, so there's nuances Andrew will talk about in terms of formal and informal conversations for bills to be moving. But what this legislation would actually do, it would not mandate that this is a way that automation would be required for enforcement, but it would just allow a municipality to actually use cameras in certain locations to do automated enforcement. And the beauty of this bill too, in terms of the bias conversation about how police officers and drivers are out there, because we are very much concerned about the inequities in terms of how laws are actually enforced out there. This would not even take a photograph of a person's face. This would just be a license plate, essentially, that would be captured similarly to how tolling is done with automated tolling. So this would be more of a driving, not necessarily a moving offense, but more a citable offense. So it's actually a pretty low citation of a $25 penalty for a violation, although if violations rack up, that could then be taken up to the RMV, so a person would have to deal with it on a more profound level. But it creates procedures as well about where cameras should be placed, and it creates a public database for all of these offenses, which watchdogs like MassBike and other nonprofits and advocacy organizations can actually keep track of some of these citations, which is very important as well for making sure that, again, the distribution of citations is done in an equitable manner and not just in majority minority communities or Black and brown communities, but we're actually able to track that. And Andrew can talk a little bit more about that when I hand this over in a second as well. But this is a piece of legislation which is very important that we feel for actually changing the culture of driving. Because we all know in Massachusetts, and I'm kind of guilty of it too, that we have this kind of culture of like, well, you don't really need to signal. You don't really need to have street signs up necessarily. It's like, if people aren't aware that you're changing lanes, that's their problem. It's the onus of safety is not necessarily on the drivers culturally, but this would help to move that needle. And a third bill that we'll talk about is an act to reduce traffic fatalities. This is co-sponsored by Senator Brownsberger, which actually was passed by the Senate unanimously last year in the 2019 legislative session. It's currently in the House. I should update this. There are a couple of parallel bills. The current bill, actually, I should update this for you. It's actually filed by Chairman Strauss of the Transportation Committee and Rep. Moran. But what this would do, it would a whole bunch of things, but where it matters most for cyclists, it would require a 3-foot passing or 4-foot passing or 5-foot passing distance of vulnerable users. So it would make a designation of road users that are out there who are considered to be vulnerable, not just bicyclists, but also pedestrians, state troopers who are writing tickets on the side of the road, construction workers, tow truck drivers would be considered vulnerable. So it would designate a minimum number of feet of passing distance. It would require side guards on large vehicles and trucks that are leased or in contracts with the Commonwealth and the municipalities that are out there, because we know one of the biggest dangers to cyclists are right-turning large vehicles. That's where a lot of the fatal crashes happen. It would mandate a standardization of reporting of bicyclist and pedestrian crashes and fatalities, which arguably is really tough out there to actually get the data on bike crashes and bike fatalities. That's something that MassBike is working on, but it's a really hard challenge because there are different types of vendors who do police citations. It's a whole other hour-long conversation there, but it would help standardize that. And it would allow municipalities to be able to lower their speed limits in accordance to their municipal speed limits on state-owned roads. So if a DOT or DCR-owned road goes through municipality that has a lower speed limit, it would allow the municipality to require that state-owned road to match the local speed limit, which is unfortunately one of the challenges that we're facing out there, because sometimes the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand. And if you have a municipality with a lower speed limit like Cambridge has, Boston has, but a state-owned road goes through it, it's not necessarily beholden to that speed limit. And that's a whole other conversation right there as well. And then one more bill that I'll bring up too, and by the way, I'll follow up with an email with all these bills so you can chase down your local legislators. A little bit more of an esoteric one is an act that would authorize municipalities to use CPA funding, which is the Community Preservation Act funding, to acquire rail trail land. And this is a nuanced bill, which would just add a couple sentences into the CPA legislation, which would just allow municipalities to take Community Preservation Act funding, if allowed by local CPA boards or committees, to actually purchase or lease for long-term right-of-ways of former rail trails to be used for recreation, which arguably is our pathway network that we're trying to build up throughout the whole state, relies on a lot of dormant rail trails. But there are some small hitches that the legislation for the Community Preservation Act might preclude funding from CPA to actually go and acquire these right-of-ways. And it's more nuanced than I want to get into right now, but this bill would actually very explicitly allow folks from a CPA committee to use that funding to do right-of-ways, which might be right where your backyard is, Andrew, in Sudbury. This is a very pertinent conversation so that we can extend the Mass Central Rail Trail and the Bruce Friedman Rail Trail using CPA funding. This is also an issue in Westfield and a few other places in Massachusetts where CPA funding should or could go towards rail trail acquisition, but it's a little bit of a hiccup, mainly because these lands might not actually be purchased. These are leased lands, and so we need to make sure that the language in legislation says that it's okay to use that funding, even if it's a long-term lease, even if it's a 99-year lease, we can even use CPA funding for that. It's a small little nuance. So this is a smattering, I will say, of some legislation that we're working on. Some of it is traffic safety related, some of it is enforcement related, some of it is funding related, but all of it requires acts of the State House. And then the last thing I'll ramble on, so thanks for allowing me to go this far, is electric bicycles. So this is something that if you've been paying attention to what MassBike has been working on since I've taken the helm about a year and a half ago, is the definitions of e-bikes in our state codes are antiquated, and they actually lend themselves to be towards moped definitions in terms of the size of the engine, in terms of gas, and the speed in terms of 35 miles an hour. Obviously, if you've ridden an e-bike out there, they are not mopeds. We need to actually redefine electric bicycles, because right now they're kind of in a gray area between motorized bicycles, which they are motorized, and bicycles. We'll call them analog bicycles. But unfortunately, we do not have good definitions of what e-bikes are. So what MassBike is working on is to actually rewrite so that there are 3 classes of e-bikes which follow the federal standard, which is how the feds actually mandate it. So the manufacturers who sell interstate basically already rely on this codification. And every other state in the New England area also follows this 3-class definition. We're trying to build a 3-class definition of e-bikes, which would then allow local municipalities and jurisdictions to regulate differently from analog bicycles and mopeds, to actually have regulations that go towards electric bicycles independently. And this is important because right now we are at a precipice of kind of a boom and new micromobility options that are out there, yet we don't know what these devices are. So it's really hard to have regulations on a local level based off an unclear definition. And it really would help to have a statewide definition. And if you're going to ride in an interstate or in a regional pathway, for instance, let's say you're riding from the Northern Strand Trail in Lynn and you want to get to the Minuteman pathway, you're going to be passing through about a dozen different municipalities, which might have a dozen different regulations based off what these bikes are. So what MassBike is working on is at least a classification system that we're all speaking the same language as to what e-bikes are, which would follow basically what you'll be able to buy from a bike shop, because these are what are being built nationally. So these are the nuances of statewide legislation, and the reason that MassBike focuses so much on statewide work is that nearly every regulation that impacts your ride is based off a state code, not a national code, not a local code, but a state code, except for a very few, like where you can park your bike or whether or not you can ride on a sidewalk. Everything else is pretty much a state codification. So this is why we are working so much in the State House. And with that, I will remind everybody that we'll follow up with what all of these bills are, who the sponsors are, where they are sitting, and a follow-up email here for some action items. And with that, I'm going to ask Andrew to jump on in with any further thoughts, and I'll start paying attention to the chat and the Q&A. So thanks for letting me ramble about our work.
Thank you, Galen. I think you did a pretty good job of overviewing those bills. So I'm not going to touch on them unless there are specific questions related to them. You had asked if I was able to do a quick overview of the legislative process, which I'm happy to do if you think that's useful.
That's why I'm here, yeah.
Okay, great, sure. So in Massachusetts, I presume all MassBike members are living in Mass, but maybe I shouldn't. You're represented in the House and the Senate. You have a state House member who represents a district of about 44,000 people, and you have a state senator who represents a district of about 170,000 people. We have a 2-year legislative session, which starts in January of the odd-numbered year, when the new class of newly elected legislators or incumbents are sworn in. As that starts, we have a bill filing deadline for timely filed legislation, and that just means that any bill you file in that first couple-week period, it will automatically be referred to the relevant subject matter committee. So most of our bicycle legislation ends up, of course, in the Joint Committee on Transportation. Mm-hmm. So once a bill is drafted and filed, it can be filed in the House or the Senate, or both. But of course, only senators can file in the Senate, only House members can file in the House. The bill would be then assigned to the relevant subject matter committee. The committee then must hear it, give it a public hearing where anybody, members of the public, advocates like Galen, can show up and testify in support or in opposition to any bill. So that is, that has to happen before, I want to say it's like the first week in February of the even-numbered year. So bill filing deadline, bills are assigned to committee. The bills should be heard by the committee with other bills of like subject matter. So usually there will be a bike bill hearing. And after the bill is heard, anytime between then and February of the even numbered year, which is called Joint Rule 10-day, it refers to Joint Rule 10 of the Joint Rules of the House and Senate, which says that bills have to be acted on by their initial committee by that date, kind of a deadline to drive the flow of legislation. And so, of course, like most organizations, the legislature also procrastinates. So most bills are referred out of committee closer to Joint Rule 10 than they are than the other point, although after a bill is heard, it could be reported favorably and sent along. Once it's sent along once it receives a favorable report from its subject matter committee, it will usually go to, in the Senate at least, we would send it either to Ways and Means or to the Joint Committee on Rules, which are kind of traffic cop committees. They do a final, really close review, and those are Senate-only committees before sending something to the floor. A bill would go to Ways and Means if it has a projected fiscal impact of over $100,000. A bill would go to the Senate Committee on Rules if it has an estimated fiscal impact of less than that. The staff in those committees do final work on it. They have very highly skilled attorneys that really make sure everything checks through up and down. And at that point, it could be sent to the floor for debate and a vote. So this past session, we received favorable reports from the Committee on Transportation for an act to reduce traffic fatalities. It was then sent to Senate Ways and Means, open for amendment and up for debate. And that bill passed the Senate, I want to say at some point in 2019. It was one of the first things we took up. It's the second session in a row that we were able to get that through the Senate, this time unanimously. I think automated enforcement actually came through public safety, which was a different route for it this time, but was one that was ultimately good because it did also get a favorable report, went through Ways and Means, went to the floor in the Senate, and then a procedural hiccup has kind of paused that debate. And that, in fact, happened in the last formal session that we had before COVID hit. So we do expect to resume that bill, but we've had, as you can imagine, a very disrupted schedule of formals and informals since that happened. Galen wanted me to explain informal session. Well, actually, let me just back up and get through the end of the legislative session. So formal sessions go until the end of July. So we're in kind of that dead sprint and end of session right now where legislation that's at all controversial needs to be taken up in a formal session, which is where all of the members of the legislature convene and vote. That's important for procedural reasons. The joint rules do permit members to block or limit legislation that happens in an informal session. So a formal session is where all of the members of the legislature show up. An informal session is where at least 2 members of the majority party and 1 member of the minority party are present. You can still pass legislation in that, but any member can show up and derail debate on any bill for any reason because you don't have the right number of legislators there to override a procedural objection. So a lot of lawmaking does in fact happen in informal sessions, but if there's anything that's controversial, it has to happen in a formal session. So that's kind of the deadline that we're looking at right now at the end of July. Although I do expect we could possibly do traffic fatalities in an informal, and we could possibly finish up automated enforcement in an informal, although if anybody followed that debate, it was pretty contentious when we took it up. That's where I am. I've definitely bled over my time, but happy to kick it over to Josh or Galen if you want to MC and let us know what you'd like to do next.
Well, I have one question I want to add to, which actually came in from Erica on the Q&A, but what are some characteristics of an effective of effective advocates and advocacy campaigns. But I think actually I might hold off on that question till the very end
Okay.
to let Josh get in here. But in the meantime, I do want to share a poll right before we pass it to Josh, which related to effective advocates and advocacy campaigns. But for those of you who are out there, please take a look at this poll that just popped up on your screen. Have you ever contacted your legislators, state or federal, to ask for support of a bicycle-related bill? And Andrew, while this is going on, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how important it is for constituents to actually chime in and contact their legislators. Does that really matter? And who do they really reach out to? And at what point in the process does it make the most impact?
Sure, absolutely. So that's a great question as far as the timing aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
Legislators and legislative staff are drinking from a fire hose. I mean, everything that is happening in the state, people are contacting the legislature about any number of issues. So I think it's always best to contact your legislator when something is about to happen. You're giving them a specific ask.
Okay.
It's not a good idea to just call up your legislator and say like, hey, I'm concerned about bicycle safety. You should support all bills related to bicycle safety. I don't think you're not giving them a specific thing to do at a specific time. And I think that's really important. So it's important to pay attention to mass bike and what's happening as far as legislative updates, because you want to be able to call your legislator and say, hey, you're a member of the transportation committee. The transportation committee needs to take a vote on whatever bill by whatever day. I'm asking that you support this bill to give it a favorable report out of committee, or if there's a bill before the full legislature, asking them to vote on a specific bill on a specific day. As far as how important it is, I think it's incredibly important. Especially, I get the sense from talking to other staff members, there's a perception that bicycle issues are a city issue. It's a Boston, Cambridge, Somerville issue. So especially if you live outside of that region, definitely contact your legislators and let them know how important these issues are to you, because I think it's really easy for them to overlook unless they're hearing from people, unless they can say, oh, hey, that e-bike bill, I got a call about that from somebody who expressed how important it was. Mm-hmm. As far as who to reach out directly to your legislators. I think the most effective advocacy is often the hardest to do. It's really easy to click and sign your name to a petition. It's hard to spend 10 minutes, meeting with your senator and explaining to them an issue that's important to you, but that will stick with them a lot more. I mean, certainly we're recording every contact that we have with any constituents about anything, but if you want it to really stick in their head, it's a lot, I think, more impactful to speak from your personal experience and explain to your legislator why something is important to you.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for you, Andrew.
Sure.
I was sort of thinking about this. That's very good to know that obviously, I mean, it makes sense that it would be more impactful to have a conversation with your legislator. But I want to know what makes you working for Senator Brownsberger, but just generally, working for any legislator. What makes you nervous, or what would keep you up at night? Would it be 15 calls coming in from different people on a single issue? Would it be a big stack of letters, or a bunch of people knocking on the door of the office? Like, is there something that would do more than just well, I've registered my feelings on this, and that's one person? But is there like a point at which it reaches a critical mass where it's like, all right, 25 people have talked to us about this one issue, or
Sure.
25 people have left voicemails, or whatever it is? Is there a certain point where it gets it reaches a fever pitch?
So, classic law school answer, it depends. I think that, as I said before, the more invested you are in your issue and the more that's able to show, I think that's what really moves legislators. So if it's 10 calls from people who are sharing a very personalized experience, that's more impactful than 5,000 emails from somebody where if you respond to them, they're not really, you can tell they're not really engaged. A quick aside, a few years ago, as I said, we track everything that's coming into the office. We received thousands and thousands of emails about GMO food and GMO labeling. So we said, okay, this is the #1 issue people are writing to us about. Let's convene a town hall meeting about this. We rented out Watertown Middle School, 1,500 seat auditorium. We physically mailed, I think, 3,000 invitations to everybody who had written to us about it.
Oh man. Yeah.
And about 20 people showed up. And the lesson we learned from that was, it was a very low friction advocacy opportunity for people. They probably clicked to add their name to a petition. And so even though we did get thousands of names associated with that petition, the people themselves weren't very invested. So I think when legislators start hearing from a lot of people who are very invested, that's really what will cause them to.
So would that really be more towards like phone calls and stuff over email?
I think it depends. Senator Brownsberger answers all of his own email and gets to inbox 0 every 24 to 48 hours. So if you are writing to him, he is personally responding and he will see what you're writing. I don't think that's the case in every office. So, other offices are maybe more, are going to be moved more by a phone call. Other offices may be moved more by a meeting request. By the way, to everybody here, your legislator will meet with you. I've only worked for 2. I worked for Barney Frank, who used to be a congressman representing Newton and areas south, and worked for Senator Brownsberger for the last 7 years, and both of them would meet with any constituent just as a request. So don't think that, you can't just call up your legislator and get a meeting. Absolutely. That's going to be the highest friction thing for you to do, but it may in fact end up being the most impactful. So.
Yeah, and just to throw in Mass Bike there as well, we're happy to help facilitate meetings. We can co-attend or just help set up. We've got great relationships, especially in the Transportation Committee and throughout the State House. And part of my day, of course, was spending time in the State House, just walking the halls, which was, I miss those days. But if you need assistance or at least want to touch base with Mass Bike, you can let us know how your meetings have gone so that we can collaborate on these issues. And I will say that one other thing that constituents can do is file bills and ask legislators to file bills on their behalf, which have been very effective. So if a legislator themselves does not have the initiative or the concern, you can make it their concern by asking them to file, which is how I've approached some of these issues. So I asked my local state senator, Sal DiDomenico, to file the e-bikes bill. And I asked him because he was my guy. And, I was able to call him up, have a meeting with him and say, hey, Sal, thank you for being my senator. I really appreciate it. I have this concern and this bill that I want you to go and file. And he did. And
yeah, I'd say at least half of our bills are ideas that have come to us from constituents. Somebody sees a problem with government, wants a change, and we help them try to render that into language if feasible. And if it's a good idea, we'll file it.
Mm-hmm. Great. I want to pass the mic over to you, Josh, to jump in from the kind of the practical side. And I realize that this may be a little more freewheeling than we had in the last presentation, but if you want to take it to just talk a little bit about how you're seeing things enacted in the real world once things get signed and passed and put out there.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, when I was thinking about what we'd be talking about here, it sort of struck me that the internet has become such a source for answers for everybody, and we've gotten sort of accustomed to that, where if you want to know the answer to something, you go to the internet and that's where you'll find your answer. But one sort of obvious or sort of, I guess, glaring exception to that is legal advice on legal matters, legal interpretations. And, that is for very good reason, because when you're talking about legal matters, it's often, almost always, very high stakes. and very small, very slim margin for error. And so some guy online wants to say, oh yeah, it's a 5-year statute of limitations in Massachusetts. Don't worry about it. And it's actually 3 years. Well, this guy doesn't want to be on the hook for that. And also, there's no way to verify that. You want to be talking to someone who actually knows what they're talking about. And so when it comes to bike stuff, I've always tried to put this information out there because, Massachusetts has, and most other states have this, the general laws of the Commonwealth are available online. masslegislators.gov, I guess. And you can search whatever you want. It's a fairly well-designed site, and you can read all the laws that apply to you as a cyclist. You can read the entire general laws if you want, but that isn't really enough to sort of just have the bare text. And it's not super complicated stuff. I mean, it takes a little getting used to, but you can read through it and get a general understanding of what's expected of you as a cyclist, what you can and cannot do. But it doesn't really, as you said, take things into the real world. So, I try to do that when I was writing my website initially and sort of break it down for people into real world examples. But, I always try and I get tons of emails from people just asking random legal questions. And I try not to be, a snob about it where I say, well, you'll have to, retain me and here's my fee. And I always provide this information free of charge. And because I think that an educated populace, an educated community is going to be, overall better and more powerful, I think, when it comes to asking for better infrastructure, more accommodations, better laws, than if we didn't know what we have to work with. So, the laws were on the website and available to everybody well before I started my law practice. But I think that letting people know the specifics of what they mean in the real world is a very powerful thing. And so, I always like getting up in front of people and finding out what they're wondering about, because, almost all this stuff is very sort of everyday for me. And I don't really see it the same way as someone who doesn't have to think about bike crashes all the time. But because I do, it makes sense to me that, the difference between being in a bike lane and being in a crosswalk. I just actually dealt with this very recently in a case where a client was hit on Beacon Street and Charlesgate. You know where that is? Over by the river, sort of after Mass Ave. And there's a bike lane there that it's green, and it sort of, when it crosses the on-ramp to get onto Storrow Drive, it becomes dashes, or not dashes, but bars of green. And this client came to me and said, I was hit by a car getting onto that on-ramp, and I was, riding in the crosswalk, and they hit me. And I was like, oh, as soon as I heard crosswalk, I was just like, oof, this is gonna be a bit of a slog, because, and this is something that I don't think a lot of people know, but in Massachusetts, crosswalks offer no protection for cyclists. And this is something that Mass Bike, I know, has worked on for many years. It's sort of one of the last really glaring holes in our legislative structure as it pertains to bicycles, because we have not only tons of crosswalks, but also a number of bike paths that feed into crosswalks where there's a crossing. So take the Southwest Corridor, for instance. You're on a bike path, and then all of a sudden there's a crosswalk, and it's not illegal to ride a bike in a crosswalk, but you have to imagine it as if that crosswalk wasn't there. People feel comfortable riding in crosswalks because they're used to walking in crosswalks and that where they're protected. But under Massachusetts law, if you're on a bicycle, you don't count as a pedestrian. Mm-hmm. And so it's, and I've been lucky a number of times over the years where insurance adjusters don't understand this bit of nuance. And so it hasn't been an issue. But in some cases, you know, they say, well, what was he doing on the crosswalk? He should have gotten off his bike and walked it across the road. And technically they're right. And not that, you know, not doing so would be a violation of the law, but if you want the protection of a crosswalk, you have to be a pedestrian. Mm-hmm. But, you know, when I first saw back to this client who was hit in what he thought was a crosswalk, he sent me some pictures and I take a look at it and, oh, no, that used to be a crosswalk. Now it is a bike lane that has sort of gaps painted into it, but it is still very much a bike lane. And it's just these, you know, I don't know, there are all these different, it's always changing the relationship between infrastructure and the laws and you know, it's something that you got to sort of, I think people need to sort of keep abreast of it. But anyway, I'm interested if anyone anyone watching has any questions about any of this stuff or about something they've been wondering for years. I often find people who are, you know, they're pretty sure they read on a blog somewhere that something is the case, but you know, they haven't really been confident in it. And I can't say for sure that I'll be able to give you a confident answer. But if anyone has any questions like that, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, and thank you, Josh, for that specific example of the crosswalks too. I have a couple thoughts to chime in there. Is that, you know, there's a third leg to the stool that we don't have on this panelist, which essentially would be the engineer, the designer, and the planner who builds the guidelines in from the DOT or the DCR or a municipality. And two thoughts I have, particularly for that one example of that crosswalk under Charles Gate, is interesting because it changes jurisdictions in the course of a block.
Oh, right.
It goes from the city of Boston to the DCR, which is a state thing, Department of Conservation and Recreation, because it's entrance or a drive, and then it goes back to the city of Boston. So that's why sometimes it's very challenging to have contiguous infrastructure, because literally it's different guidelines, different municipalities, different jurisdictions.
Yeah, and that's also state police because it's getting onto the state highway. So the state police are the ones who responded.
Exactly. And I've had the situation where somebody's been struck, say, on a bridge crossing the Charles River, and local police will show up and say, oh, no, this is state police. And then they'll just leave, and then wait for the state police to show up. So that's always sort of good news in my book, just because state troopers tend to write better reports than the BPD. You know, Boston police reports are notoriously not great, especially when it comes to writing about cyclists and leaving their bias out of it. They seem to have a problem doing that. So, but yeah, I always like to see a state police report. Takes a little longer to get it, but they tend to get it right. Yeah, definitely have some work to do with some municipalities. And then the other thought I'll have is with the crosswalk concern, particularly. I know that another lawyer who is a friend of MassBike, Andrew Fisher, actually helped part of the initial founding of MassBike way back when. Almost every session tries to get this issue in front of the Joint Transportation Committee to say, hey, if it's a bikeway and it's a crosswalk, bicyclists should not have to dismount to have the rights of a safe crossing. You know, full disclosure, I've been at this role only for one legislative session, so I've only really been around for one round of these conversations, but there is an immense amount of pushback on that issue, mainly because we are a very litigious society, and there's caution from a legislator's perspective. This is my opinion here, viewing it from MassBike, is that people are very cautious to say, oh, well, if we can bring more lawyers into the conversation, that would be a complication, a harmful thing. So really the easiest thing to say, and the cop-out, in my opinion, kicking the can down the road, is, oh, a cyclist should just have to dismount. Then we don't have to deal with the issue at all. But practically, that's not how it happens. And
no one knows to do that, right?
Yeah, and it's signs might be up maybe, but it's
yeah. They put them up on the Cape on the Cape Cod Rail Trail. I was just on that this past weekend.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Nobody does it. I mean, I felt like an asshole. I was the only person. My fiance and I insisted we get off at every crossing.
Yeah.
And she's like, I don't think I can keep doing this. Like, this is ridiculous. I'm like, well, I'm not going to let someone see me. Not, I don't want to be the guy who's out there, riding along with everybody else. But yeah, it feels really stupid because cars are going to stop for you either way, and nobody else is doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, just to say that if you want to file a bill, and props to Andrew Fisher, just keep filing that bill, Andy. Like, we're here to support it. If we can actually get this, and it's a hard conversation to have, no question about it. But specifically on that one issue, it's like if it's a designated bikeway, like the Cape Cod Rail Trail is, and it crosses over, ideally the legislation will move forward. But we haven't had appetite in the legislation and in the State House to pick that up. And then one thing I want to throw to both of you, where there's a little bit of friction, just to prime the pump a little bit, and please feel free to check out the Q&A too, Josh and Andrew. There's a few questions that have popped in. We're going to go a little bit beyond 1 o'clock for folks, just for a few more minutes. If you do need to bounce, feel free. That's totally fine. We're going to record the rest of this. But I just want to prime one question, because I know there was a little bit of friction on this one, where with the bill, an act to reduce traffic fatalities, which has a lot of really good things about cyclist protections, there is one that pertains directly towards, Josh, your role as a lawyer battling insurance companies, and Andrew, your role in crafting this bill to make sure that people are as safe as possible out there. And this is related to the requiring of a red rear light on a bicycle if you're riding at night. Now, to get everybody up to speed, the current law, and I believe you mentioned this in our last webinar, Josh, the current law has it that which Mass Bike helped craft, is that you are required to have either a red rear light or a red rear reflector, which the onus is on the person behind. If they're driving, if they have headlights on, they should be able to see you with a rear reflector. But the way that the bill has been crafted with the act to reduce traffic fatalities, it will require a red rear light for a cyclist to be riding after, or it's an hour before sunset, an hour after sunrise, visible by X amount of feet. It's all in the bill. But the idea that it now would require a light and not just a reflector. I'm wondering, Josh, from your perspective, battling the insurance companies, what that means, and Andrew, from your perspective, is crafting this bill, how that one piece, that nuance of this awesome bill, which Mass Bike fully supports, how that conversation went. Maybe Josh, I'll start with you, and I don't want to spend too much time because we're a little bit over one.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the idea behind it, because we all know that having a light behind you is better than just having a reflector. But the problem in the real world is that this isn't really about enforcement. It's about what happens after a crash. And if you're hit, and being hit from behind is the least likely way that you're going to get hit. Just based on my experience, at least dealing with bike crashes for 10 years, it's you're far more likely to be hit from the side than from behind or doored. But it's having a rear reflector protects you against being hit from behind. And if it's nighttime and you have a rear reflector, it doesn't have to be turned on. That's just one part of it. It doesn't have to be turned on. It doesn't need batteries. It's always doing its job, which is retro reflection. It's sending the light from a driver's headlights back to them so they can see you from farther away than they normally would be able to. And so, it does its job. It doesn't do as good a job as an active lighting source, but again, it never runs out of batteries. It doesn't break off in a crash. And I think that was the example that I used when we were talking about it last time. I've had multiple clients who were hit by cars, and the police report says that they didn't have a rear light when it was sitting in the gutter somewhere. It had, from the impact of the crash, it dislodged the light, and the insurance company tried to say, well, he didn't have a rear light, that there's a law that says you have to have a rear light. It's their fault. And, sometimes I've had a couple times where I've been able to just take a picture of the bike with that still had a rear reflector. So the driver should have seen that. And it sort of takes that out of the equation. But there's also times like the one I went over in our last Zoom thing, which was I went to the scene and found the pieces of the smashed light and sent that to the insurance adjuster. But it's really about the bare minimum to be in compliance and not the ideal, because anytime you look at these laws, it's really, you have to see it through the lens of, well, not the best, you have to see it through the lens of how is this going to play out after a crash. And I've seen it many times before where these, the laws about required equipment are used to make it, to provide comparative negligence on the part of a cyclist who really did nothing wrong. And that's what makes me the most upset about the whole thing, because it's like, those are the people who are getting hurt in this situation, is someone who was hit by a car, and in this case, hit by a car from behind. They didn't do anything wrong other than, riding their bike on the road. And I don't think that they should be punished by either, the way it would work is either the insurance company would deny liability, or they would argue for some sort of comparative negligence, saying that, some percentage of the crash was their fault, was the cyclist's fault, not more than 50%, but let's say, 25% their fault for not having a rear light, for not being in compliance with the law. And as such, the settlement, the amount that they're paid for their bike and for their injuries is diminished by 25%. Mm-hmm. And, for the insurance company, it's just part of their strategy. They want to shave some of the cost off of this, and it's, part of their business model. But I think that Massachusetts should be standing up for cyclists in this situation where, a driver wasn't paying attention, because if they had been paying attention, they would have seen the cyclist in front of them, because they have headlights and their headlights were on. That's the way that I think that we should look at it, not as, well, what's the best way to keep cyclists safe? Because, if you're riding and it's cold out and the batteries in your rear light fail, you won't know about it. You won't know about it until you get home and you go to turn off your rear light and, oh, it's already off, and it's been off this whole time. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's happened to me. So it's conceivable that it could, happen to other people. But anyway, that's just my thoughts on the matter.
Okay, thanks. And Andrew, I kind of want to ask the same question to you, because as co-crafter of this bill, how that
Sure.
went.
Yeah, so I mean, I will be the first to admit that a rear light would make Josh's job harder, although the intent would be, of course, for there to be fewer cyclists being hit from behind. Mm-hmm. This provision came into the bill, an act to reduce traffic fatalities, at the request of Senate Majority Leader Cindy Cream. Mm-hmm. He had filed a bill on the subject in the past, and when we sat down to develop the original Act to Reduce Traffic Fatalities in the 2017-2018 session, we'd convened, all interested legislators, interested advocates, and we put together an omnibus package, which consisted at that time basically of an Act to Reduce Traffic Fatalities, a hands-free draft, and an automated enforcement draft. So that was what was an omnibus bill. And we thought, if we consolidated all of these different ideas into one vehicle, we could get everybody to support the same thing. Ultimately, what came out of committee was a very pared down version of that big omnibus bill. But that's what we refiled this session as an Act to Reduce Traffic Fatalities. So that's how that requirement got in there. Mm-hmm. I don't dispute anything Josh is saying about how it would make life more difficult for cyclists trying to collect after an accident. But again, I think, the legislative intent there is it's consistent with the requirement that you have a front light. I understand that you can see the front light while you're riding. You cannot see whether your rear light is working. But the idea there is just a safety measure.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's safer to have a rear light, and we are advocates of rear lights, no question about it. We hand them out for free with our Lights Brigade, and we want everyone to have a rear light. But it's just another example of just kind of the nuances of how these conversations go. And it sounds like, Andrew, that really this was a request of a colleague who is concerned about safety. And, sometimes in these conversations, you have to go to the source. And so even though Senator Brownsberger might be the one who filed the bill, this conversation might be better had with Senator Cream, because if a change to the bill requires a conversation, especially a committee conversation between the House and the Senate, you're not going to want to have any opposition to any changes that you're requesting. So you have to kind of clear these ahead of time, make the time and effort into making sure that you're doing your due diligence there. Personally, maybe not in Mass Bike stance, personally, I'm a little on the fence on this one, because I agree that rear lights are important. I think that requiring them is a way to prevent crashes. My concern comes in, though, with how they're enforced as well. So, our concern about equitable enforcement. Do we activate another prohibition against riding, which would limit people who might not be able to have a rear light from riding or riding legally, or give police officers another opportunity to stop somebody for riding because they might not have a rear light? So these are all things to be taken into consideration, which kind of get discussed and brought out in the conversation. I do want to wrap up in a second, but I realize that we're well after 1 o'clock, and so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So thank you so much for being able to extend, and for the folks who are sticking around, I appreciate that. We're going to send up some follow-up action items in a follow-up email about certain bills that are moving, or ways to contact your local legislator to say, hey, can you please support this bill if you're on a committee? And Mass Bike will have our short list of bills that we're still pursuing, especially in these informal legislative sessions, as Andrew was mentioning. Some things are favorable enough that we can still get them through, even if they're not COVID related. But one thing I do want to end on for both you guys is, what is your kind of vision overarching? Like, if you were to be able to really kind of make cycling more promoted, barriers broken, and you all know the joys and struggles of riding out there. What are some things that we might be looking for from the legislative process to really help break down the barriers to get more people riding, and not just able-bodied folks who are young and fearless, but to really get, kids out there, commuters out there, errand runners out there, people with disabilities out there, of all economic statuses and all that. So where can legislation help there? I know that's a very broad and very deep question, just the same. But
I'm happy to start. I don't know that I don't know that there is a legislative solution to get people more interested in riding. I think one of the common things I hear is infrastructure, and that is actually a local issue. This is largely a local issue. This is also responsive to John's question of when would you contact city councilors or mayors or police chiefs. And I would say that a lot of the conversations folks are having about bicycle lanes, bicycle infrastructure, some of that is happening at the local level. Some of it is happening at the state level. Galen did highlight the Carmine Gentile bill about the Bruce Freeman. So there is an overplay there. I guess my personal belief is that infrastructure component is very important, and so that is a combination of local and state, but primarily local.
Great. That actually parlays into a question that popped in from John, who asked, how important is it to contact local legislators, so a ward councilor or chief of police? And I think the infrastructure conversation, for sure. If you want a pothole filled, if you want some bike racks put in, that's a local thing. Yep. Great. With a state regulation in terms of support and guidelines, but really it's all biking is local. Josh, maybe I'll pass that one to you. How do you feel?
Well, I think that we have sort of this great start here in Massachusetts with our excellent bike laws, as I mentioned, thanks to the work of Mass Bike. And, you know, there are still a few holes, and I don't know that they're enough that fixing them would necessarily encourage more people to ride bikes. But I think that, you know, making, for example, the crosswalk exception, or, you know, providing protection for people in crosswalks, the Vulnerable Road User Act, where it would be a 3-foot passing rule. You know, these are things that people don't really know about, or they're not enough to, I would say, convince someone who hasn't ridden a bike in 20 years to start riding their bike to work. But I think that encouraging public transit options, you know, funding the MBTA and stuff like that. You know, we're in a bit of a weird situation with COVID and public transit right now, but you know, a comprehensive approach to, you know, public transit, better infrastructure, cycle tracks, protected bike lanes. You know, these are the things that bring people, that put in people's minds that, okay, you know, riding a bike is a reasonable way and a reasonable option when it comes to how I get around. And I think we've been doing that. It's just a matter of sort of filling in the back end stuff, you know, protecting people in crosswalks, protecting vulnerable road users. And yeah, I mean, it's tough. I think that you've asked sort of the central question of all bike advocacy. So it's a little difficult, but, you know, I'm hopeful about the future.
Cool. I appreciate that. Thank you for your hope and inspiration. And yeah, I think it's a multifaceted gem that we're approaching here and that we're trying to polish and kind of get through. And some of it's safety related, like enact reduce traffic fatalities. Some of it's funding related, like the CPA, Community Preservation Act clarification. Some of it's enforcement related, because, you know, we have to really get down and make enforcement equitable and fair. And I want to thank you both, from both of your sides of the coin, for making sure that this is front and center in all the work that you do. Andrew, I want to thank you for stepping in for the senator, and send our best to Senator Brownsberger. I know he's doing some very important work this afternoon, so we can follow up with some thank yous personally with him on his criminal justice and his police reform such. And Josh, let's keep in touch. I'll share,
for sure.
I'll share some contact information with the RSVPs after this. We'll be recording this so we can put this on our YouTube channel as well. And for folks who want to watch the whole hour and a half, feel free. And any last words that you want to send off our attendees? And thank you all for spending the afternoon with us.
I'll say if anyone has a question that they would have liked to have asked, feel free to email me. You know, I'm always open to answering whatever weird bike questions that there are. Even if the answer is I don't know, I'll look into it, which is a classic attorney answer. So my email is just josh@bikesafeboston.com.
Cool. Feel free to put that in the chat there, Josh, for everyone to see.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And Galen, I just want to say thank you, and thank you to Josh for a good conversation. Thank you to everybody who stuck in here and listened. And, you know, the one takeaway that you get from me is please contact your legislators. They do want to hear from you. And you can find out who your legislators are if you go to legmap, legmap.org. Take a look at that, figure out who they are if you don't already know, and let them know what you care about. It's they do, it's why they're there. It's to serve you and to listen and respond.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Andy, for your service. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Josh, for looking out for the little guy. Cool. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate the time that you spent with us. I realize this is kind of a dense and yet esoteric conversation sometimes, but please keep in touch with Mass Bike. I want to hear from you. We want to know if you've had any instances, any circumstances, anything to share, good and bad, with your riding out there, not just for the legal aspect for things, but just in general. We have a whole slew of diverse webinars on our webpage. You go to massbike.org/webinars, where this will be archived along with some of our other ones, including maintenance topics. We had a great conversation last week about bicycle book authors. So we're trying to be pretty encouraging in our time of separation to kind of get the conversation still generated. But I realize that this is probably not the last time we're going to bring you both on to talk about some of the work that you do out there. So keep it up. And again, thanks so much.
Cool.
Cool.
Take care, everyone.
All right. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
All right.
Bye, everyone.